Welcome to Lucid Horizon, a show by the Institute of Democracy for Educational Advancement, IDEA. In this show, we talk to experts in different political and philosophical issues, specifically the ones that are more academic and less tangible, and I would call them the ones that have more utility and more potential, but have not completely their potentials and capabilities have been explored. And we this week we are going to be talking about human dignity, and our guest is Professor Colin Bird, who is an expert and has a fantastic book on the topic. And I would like to welcome him to our show. Welcome, Professor Bird.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation very much.
Yes, this is a very interesting issue, and I think it's a very neglected issue, in my opinion, and that's why we want to talk about it today. First of all, I mean, I read your book on human dignity and political criticism. It's a fascinating book, a lot of concepts. I mean, it's impossible to actually cover all the concepts in the book in one program, but I just want to touch upon the most important concepts and the issues you raise in this book. Why don't you tell us what you mean as a political philosopher by human dignity and different types of human dignity, and a little bit about the history of human dignity and how we have treated it so far?
Yeah, thanks very much, Alayar. What I'll say, first of all, is that what I'm trying to do in the book is to get away from some very standard ways of thinking about it. And those standard ways of thinking about human dignity have come to us, I would say, largely through a complicated series of historical transitions. Very, very important in that story, of course, are the various theistic religious traditions. But these ideas have been secularized over the last 200, 300 years in a variety of ways by various different thinkers. The most important and famous secularizer of human dignity in modern times, of course, is the Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant. And he's been tremendously influential, as I'm sure many of your viewers know, in contemporary political theory. What all of these, I call them traditional conceptions of human dignity, share in common, and what I believe is a kind of mistake that we need to kind of outgrow, is they share basically the idea that human dignity is a possession. It's something that is in the person, inherent, often, though not perhaps always, associated with the idea that it can't be changed. You are born with human dignity. Nothing anyone does to you can take it away or tarnish it or damage it. And this gets cashed out in a variety of different ways. But one, of course, is the standard one having to do with human rights. All human beings are members of the human family in virtue of sharing some intrinsic inherent value or worth. There's a sort of slightly later version that gets cashed out in terms of equal status and relationships of equal status. That's very important in contemporary democratic theory, as I'm sure you know. But all of these views, notwithstanding their many differences, they tend to fixate on the idea that dignity is something we possess. It doesn't really change, and it's local to the person. And what I really want to do in the book is to try to break away from that way of thinking about dignity and suggest a conception of dignity, which I believe is actually latent in the way in which we ordinarily talk about dignity and some allied categories like respect and maybe love, that conceptualizes it as a non-local, inherently relational phenomenon. It's not located in me, it's not located in you. If it appears in our conversation, then it's because of the way we relate to one another. And what, of course, goes along with that is I also want to say that it has a history, right? It can be damaged, it can be, in some cases, destroyed, it can suffer enhancement and diminishment. So there are, for example, there are ways our conversation could go, right? You could wind me up and get me really, really cheesed off. And I could go off in a huff and storm off the set. And for me, that sort of interaction would instantiate a mild, not a terribly important diminishment of human dignity, but a diminishment nonetheless. I hope that's a good start.
It's a very good start. And, before the show starts, I told you that, I'm a physicist by training. And it's very difficult, once you're trained in a certain discipline, it's very difficult to actually abandon the culture of your discipline, and it will always be with you. So, from the physics, you made an allusion to the fact that the concept of dignity, after all, is really an ethical and a religious concept. And then we have secularized it, and now you and your generation, you're taking it to the next level, and you're really putting it on a more solid human science, humanity ground, more academic ground, more, I would say, semi-scientific ground. And, I want to take it one step further and actually putting it on a hard science ground. And I want to explore that with you, whether there is such a possibility. I would say that the concept of dignity ultimately is a function of, and your degree and the extent of belief in it is a function of your perspective to life, your value base. What is your story? What's your story of the universe? How did the universe begin? Do you believe that the universe began by a God, and by your God specifically, or you think you subscribe to the scientific basis of the Big Bang and the beginning of the universe? If you believe in one of these different versions of the origin story, I will call it origin story, then I would say that origin story will completely taint or paint your concept of dignity, and whether dignity is an acquired attribute which is a function of your loyalty, of the extent of your loyalty to your faith, to the particular faith which is really extending this dignity to you, or dignity is inherent to human value regardless of their faith, regardless of their virtue, regardless of the way they actually function and their position in society. Which one do you subscribe in, and which one do you think is the way forward that you are hoping to gain from writing the book and talking about it?
Well, that's a complicated question. Let me take a stab at it, and then you can tell me if there's an aspect of it that I'm missing and that you want to develop further. But I guess part of what I want to say, maybe a little bit to react against something that you said at the beginning of the question. I strongly agree with the idea that my conception of human dignity, one of its virtues is that it promises a kind of naturalistic way to think about dignity, that in principle, we can talk intelligently about the fate of human dignity by looking at the world and inferring its symptoms, its presence, its absence in a non-mysterious way, not appealing to any metaphysical or occult qualities. So in that sense, I certainly agree with what you were suggesting. But I also find myself resisting a little bit the idea that a desirable conception of dignity, certainly I wouldn't want this to be true of mine, that it would have to be anchored in some very particular view about the origin of the universe in a large cosmopolitan universal sense. Because it's very important for me that human dignity is precisely a concept that we, as a particular community, a particular species, coping with historically particular challenges, have constructed and sometimes abused and misused. But I think it's important to localize it to the human species, right? And not think of it as part of a larger story about the origin of the universe or anything like that. But nevertheless, to think of it as a concept that is potentially helpful in thinking about how we relate to one another non-locally, how the extent to which we elicit or don't elicit respect, deference, from one another, and to the extent that we elicit only humiliation or disrespect or contempt from one another. And even in the secularized versions, I mean, Kant is a very good example of this, right? Kant uses this language of respect and humiliation and humility and contempt. But it's clear from his wider philosophical view that he thinks of these categories, when we're doing ethics anyway, he thinks of these categories as non-empirical, not really observable things, right? They're in some sense noumenal in his sense rather than phenomenal, which is what scientists do. And what I really want to do is to shift human dignity back into the realm of phenomena, to use Kantian categories. But I also think that means that we have to view it in a sense as simply a concept internal to a set of ideas and aspirations that form the human horizon, but don't particularly look beyond it. I mean, there's an interesting set of questions about how ideas about human dignity might figure in judgments about how to treat animals. And maybe the day will come when we encounter a species from another planet or intelligent life from another planet where we would have to, retool the concept for that unexpected, new, radical change. But for now, I think we just have to think of it as our concept and as relevant to how we live socially, politically, ethically together, but not as part of some bigger scientific or religious story.
That's absolutely fascinating, and that's respectable. I mean, you use the word respect, and I am, as a natural scientist, I'm fascinated by people like Kant, Immanuel Kant, and the ideas. How did he come up with the idea of dignity and respect for human being? And because as you go back beyond Immanuel Kant's time, there is no such thing as respect for human being for the mere fact that you are a human being. Respect for human being was tied to some virtues, which by itself was tied to your obedience and your utility and your how you really, your status in society and how useful society really regarded you. There was no such thing as an inherent value to human being worthy of respect. Now, if I ask you, based on the idea that you're advancing, why should we, meaning you and I and other human beings, why should we respect human beings, other human beings? But is it based on some inherent value of humans that is worthy of respect, or respect will make a better world? Respect for other human beings, observation of the human right makes a better world, and we human beings have a vested interest of making the world a better place to live.
Yeah, so my strategy for dealing with this is to basically try to detach the question of the sense in which human beings might have various sorts of inherent worth or value from the category of human dignity. They get pressed together in the traditional views so that I just come into the world with a special kind of inherent worth that is labeled human dignity. And that establishes various kinds of prohibitions on ways to mistreat me and abuse me and so forth, right? But the problem with that is that, in my view anyway, is that it makes human dignity too assured, right? It means that our human dignity is basically guaranteed, and it doesn't really matter what people do to us because our inherent worth, also known as our human dignity, is going to survive untarnished, regardless of our moral or political career, how people treat us. And the difficulty with that position, I think, is that it makes it very hard to understand why we should care about human dignity. And as you know, its force in political and social discourse, its gathering force over the last 200 years, has been precisely to motivate a very strong kind of adamant critique of certain kinds of social and political practices as being beyond the pale, right? Things like genocide, things like what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, right? We regard these as atrocities, as affronts to human dignity, right? But it seems to me there's something very odd about saying, well, human dignity is the reason for us to be outraged by what's happening in Ukraine, but the human dignity of the Ukrainian victims is going to survive untarnished regardless of whether Mariupol is bombed to smithereens. That seems to me to be a very strange way of understanding it. So what I do is to suggest, well, there really isn't, I think, a deep philosophical puzzle about the question of whether human beings have inherent value. It seems to me obvious that human beings have inherent value, superabundant inherent value along any number of dimensions, right? They have talents to offer, they have hopes and aspirations, they have important emotions and emotional commitments. There's any number of ways they can suffer, they can experience pleasure and pain and so forth. There's any number of ways in which human beings could be said to have inherent value, right? For me, though, none of those things are human dignity. Right? Human dignity, for me anyway, is exclusively a concept, at least if my theory is right, that labels the results of our interactions with other human beings, and especially significant other human beings, those who are representing major social institutions and forces in the world. And it does pick out the extent to which our inherent value is correctly recognized and realized in the world, but that's a variable, right? Sometimes people's inherent worth can go accepted in a welcoming way, bringing their potential to fruition and realization. Sometimes it dies on the vine, and it dies on the vine because major social institutions are failing to treat people with appropriate respect, and indeed abusing and disrespecting and humiliating them. And under those conditions, human dignity suffers a defeat. It is diminished in some important way. When I see images of these cities in Ukraine that have been ravaged by more or less indiscriminate bombing, as far as I can see, people weeping in the streets trying to pull the debris and to identify the corpses of their loved ones and so forth, right? That is not an image of human dignity to me, right? There's something missing there. And you can only capture that, I think, with a concept of human dignity that doesn't regard it as inherent, but rather sees it as something that is an achievement or is not achieved in the way we actually treat one another.
Yeah, I'm going to give you an example and a comparison, and you can put your concept of human dignity in this comparison that, you might kind of find it slightly inappropriate, this comparison. I want to compare invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and what Russia did, which was far worse than what Russia is doing in Ukraine, is what Russia did in Syria. Right? I mean, Syria, in Syria, Russia just did what we termed, there was a term during the American war in Vietnam, the so-called carpet bombardment. And the carpet bombardment meant, completely decimating the neighborhoods or cities or towns from the enemy. And that's what Russia did. Russia did in the Aleppo and other towns occupied by the ISIS. Russia completely destroyed regions and province of Syria, I don't know, in the hope of getting rid of all the terrorists and stabilizing the Assad government, or whatever the reason was. Russia did far worse in Syria than it has been doing in Ukraine. But at the same time, I see that the world is outraged far more about Ukraine than it was about Syria. Do you think that human dignity, the concept of human dignity, I'm not putting you in the position of describing why the world was more outraged in Ukraine and less outraged in Syria. I just want to say, if the concept of human dignity is on solid ground, it should create, and if it is an accepted culture and psyche and conscious of human being, then we should, as global citizens, we should be equally outraged in Ukraine and Syria. Don't you think that, you know, the discrepancy between the way the world viewed Syria and Ukraine is because of the fact that we have been unable to put an inherent value to human beings? And it seems to me like that, you know, people are still looking at the utility of Ukraine compared to Syria, and then they determine their position, and then they decide how outraged they should be.
No, I actually completely agree with what you said. I mean, we could have a very long discussion and argument about the relative gravity in terms of an affront to human dignity between what happened in Syria and what's happening now in Ukraine. But I completely agree with you that what's important about the category of human dignity is that, and this is an aspect that has always traditionally been associated with that category and that I very much want to maintain and not jettison, is this idea that basically all human beings should be treated in the same way, right? And that the respect that one person ought to be eliciting from others shouldn't be affected by arbitrary things that inhibit appropriately humane responses to those events and transactions and so forth. And I think there's a very interesting story to tell about, I mean, suppose it's true that we think that the outrage in respect of Ukraine was far greater than it was in the case of Syria, when in fact the Syrian case was actually far worse in lots of ways. There's going to be an interesting story to tell about what is it about culture in the West, the media in the West, the democratic discussion in the West that inhibits what I take to be the natural, respectful sympathy that we should have for any human being who is subjected to carpet bombing, chemical warfare, innocent people who have lives to lead and who are, of course, wonderful, inherently valuable people, regardless of where they come from, their faith, their ethnicity, their geographical location. One of the advantages I would suggest of my view is that it would enable us to think, again, in a reasonably fine-grained empirical way about what is it that renders people insensitive to the value of others under some conditions. And, you know, there are a number of familiar categories that tend to get mobilized here, having to do with race, religious antipathy, and so forth. But I think there are probably others as well. I think there are, you know, cultural questions about cultural affinity, distance, questions about the historical connectedness of different kinds of countries and their histories over time. But I completely agree with you that the aspiration has to be, right, that regardless of how we compute the relative gravity of different kinds of atrocities, that judgment should be made from a standpoint that isn't particularly tainted by special sympathies or partialities to certain groups as opposed to others. It has to be the inherent value of human beings as such. It's just that I don't think that that inherent value of human beings as such should be labeled human dignity. Human dignity is the result of our treating everybody in that relatively impartial way. But I completely agree with you.
Yeah, you know, let me give you a 45-second abstract and compressed view of how today's physics considers human being as the ultimate product of the universe, a universe that began spontaneously in a big bang with no contribution, no interference of any supernatural agent. And then, you know, within the first 380,000 years of the age of the universe, there was the age of darkness. And then out of the expansion and cooling and expansion and cooling, you know, the electrons and protons bind and they form hydrogen. And the universe only makes hydrogen, actually a little bit of helium, but just hydrogen. And then, you know, hydrogens, they have so much hydrogen that they collapse under their masses and they make stars. And then planets, and then the rest is details, you know, then the galaxies and so on and so forth. And then there are many, you know, there are 14 billion years of story that I'm going to go fast forward to this particular planet, this particular galaxy, and the fact that humans have been the ultimate product, or the most valuable, the most complex product, at least the unique product of nature, which has the attribute of consciousness. We humans on this planet, we are not aware of any other agent with consciousness. And that consciousness, and that brings me, that's a good segue for me to get into human dignity. I mean, our human dignity is ultimately tied to this attribute that is unique among humans, and that is consciousness. It's our consciousness, ability to gain knowledge to the world around us. And to the extent that we gain awareness to the world around us, and we use the same awareness to explore for the unknown. And that really brings us to the role of science, and how science has actually empowered us, gave us the tools to become more aggressive in the pursuit of universalization of the concept of human dignity. If it wasn't for the fact that the science showed that men and women are equal, have equal capabilities, blacks and whites have equal capabilities, people of different religion and different ethnicities and different sexual orientations, they all have this attribute, this potential that they can be neurosurgeons, and they can be soccer players, they can be tennis players and dancers, and so on and so forth. And that ability is inherent to this kind of life called humans. I think if we make that, which is really standing on very solid ground, and really that kind of provides an avenue for us to tie human dignity to natural sciences and to physics and chemistry and biology and so on. If we do that, don't you think we can help universalize human dignity, and ultimately go out there and demand that human dignity, very similar to human right, Declaration of Human Rights, be put in the international legal code and international relations, and hope that this approach can eventually outlaw wars and feuds and hostilities and nuclear weapons, and deal with all the evils of the modern life?
Well, let me say just three things about that. We said a lot, and there are lots of things I would want to talk about. I mean, the first thing to say with respect to consciousness, again, I can't disagree with you that consciousness and human dignity are very, very closely bound up. That's got to be right. At the same time, I think it's really important not to follow the traditionalist view and suggest that human dignity is so tightly connected to the possession of consciousness that we would then be forced into a position of saying, well, somebody in a coma who is never going to be conscious again isn't owed the respect that would confer upon them or induce a sense of human dignity in their relations to those who are responsible for their existence under those conditions, right? One has to be very careful, I think, not to tie human dignity to any particular trait like consciousness, because consciousness varies, right? And we're not conscious really fully in certain parts of the sleep cycle. And we don't want to say, well, when you're in one of those cycles of the sleep cycle where you're not fully conscious, then we can treat you like an object in the universe, like a rock or something like that. We don't want to say that. So that's the first thing I would want to say. The second thing I would want to say is with regard to science, right? I mean, to me, science and human dignity are connected up in the following way. I think it's, well, at least one way. There's many ways, but one of the most important, I think, is that a point, it's a sort of subtext in the book, but I think it's actually a very, very important intuition. I could probably have made more of it in the book. But the idea of human beings being deluded, the idea that human beings live in darkness or are in some way being lied to or deceived about their situation, that seems to me to be to oppose the idea of a community living together and affirming their dignity, right? If you're deluded and living a lie, right, you're not fully partaking in human dignity, because what it is to partake of human dignity in part is to stand up and face the world as it is honestly and not indulge illusions, right? And from that point of view, of course, the scientific project is tremendously important because what it's achieved, and of course, we don't know how much more. Certainly, it's going to achieve a great deal more in the future, but that's the connection with human dignity. It's that it's one of the greatest intellectual and institutionalized venues in which human beings have fought to rid themselves of illusion and sham and deceit in the world. And so that's the connection I would see between the two. The third thing I would say had to do with the point about international law, and we can have a discussion about this because I'm myself in many different minds about this question, and it's not clear to me that the view I reach in the book points towards more legal declarations and more legally institutionalized ways of outlawing genocide and atrocity and so forth. That might be where it's heading, and I certainly don't see anything wrong with buttressing international law and trying to bring those who commit atrocities and so forth to justice and all the rest of it. That I'm certainly not opposed to doing that. But I think that in the first instance, my argument points towards something rather more basic, which is how do you stop people from being beastly to one another in the first place? How do you cultivate the effective mood, the sorts of respectful dispositions, right, on which we all depend for being treated with a certain degree of consideration and regard, and on which the continuance and health and vitality of human dignity depends. It's rather more diagnostic, right? It's more like the way in which we diagnose certain kinds of medical conditions, right? And it's not clear to me that increasing, as it were, the scope for medical malpractice suits would necessarily help doctors make sounder decisions about how to diagnose conditions, right? So that's the third thing I would say. So I may disagree with you a little bit about just how central international legal codification of norms of human dignity are going to be. But I don't have a dogmatic view on that at all. It's just a suspicion.
Yes, fair enough. I see that, in terms of utility of the concept of human dignity, ultimately we are hoping that we can eliminate all the evil on earth, all the maltreatments of man by man, all the atrocities, all the destructions, and all the damage to the environment. So it seems to me that if I run into a total stranger on the street, my respect for him is solely based on my admission that this person has the same capabilities as I do.
Exactly.
If for any reason, for the reason of difference in appearance, for the reason of my weaknesses, or for the reason of his weaknesses or her weaknesses, for whatever reason, whether the reason a function of the circumstances or encounter, or my psyche and my philosophy, on whatever reason, if I am convinced, and if society and my philosophy has given me tools and legitimations to convince that this person is any less than I think in such a world it's very difficult to hope for the proliferation of the concept of human dignity. As such, this takes me back to that inherent value, the fact that we have to look for a concept that it gives us court presentable evidence that every human being has identical capabilities as every other human being, and correlation between potentials and skills are entirely the blame of the society and lack of opportunities, and not the person, which really takes the blame off the off the shoulder of that person and denies me the opportunity of legitimizing my lack of treatment of this person with dignity. So you make a beautiful comparison between the utilitarian and the inherent concept of dignity. And it seems to me that if we stop anything short of some kind of a science-based inherent value for human dignity, we will not be able to achieve the ultimate goal of using human dignity to make a better world possible.
Yeah, I mean, I have some minor disagreements with little points you made there. I guess I wouldn't want to tie it quite so tightly to science, because I think that some of the dispositions and affects that we're talking about aren't really intellectual at all. I mean, when you talk about seeing somebody, a stranger, suffer, I mean, you're in an international airport, you're traveling somewhere, and you see someone who's obviously suffering, right? You never met them, they're wearing strange clothes, they look different from the people you hang out with and so forth. But you ought to respond to them sympathetically and respectfully in the same way as you would to any human being, right? Because they're capable of suffering. But I don't think that's because we have any strong commitment to science or anything like that. I think it's something much more sort of, I mean, I hesitate to say primitive, but rudimentary about our interpersonal psychology. So that's one thing I would say. Another point that I would make, this doesn't really directly respond to what you just said, but it does seem to me to be an important consideration in all of this. I mean, I think we have to also recognize that while I fully agree, I think we're totally on the same page in the sense that as a kind of motivating force, the idea of a human dignity in which we all share regardless of our differences and our capabilities and our talents and so forth, that's a tremendously potent, mobilizing idea. And it's very, very persuasive, which is why, of course, increasingly political movements, social movements, religions appeal to it more and more today, I think, right? But I also think we have to be honest that that very edifying picture of human dignity is often at odds with the uses to which the category of dignity and respect has often historically been used. And you mentioned this actually in your earlier sort of historical account, right? Because before modernity, it would really have been in some ways unthinkable to associate the idea of dignity with something that is all-encompassing. It was always associated with some kind of hierarchical, differential, discriminating conception. We're the ones with dignity, you're the you're the subordinates and so forth. And of course, it's also connected often to the affect of pride and the desire to distinguish yourself competitively and antagonistically from others. So the concept of human dignity is not, I think, a complete friend. I mean, that is, you have to identify some aspects of the historical record about the way the category has been used, and you really have to say we need to lop those off, because that's actually led us astray. It's led us into a kind of tribalism. It's led us into the idea that our race has greater dignity than your race and so forth, and that's a disaster. But I still think that you can generalize the category in a helpful way, and it can perform a useful diagnostic role in social and political criticism.
So in the remaining 10 minutes, I want to bring us to earth and apply everything that we talked about to today's crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And to the situation to the heartbreaking situation in Ukraine, and the fact that, against all odds and against all our beliefs in the 21st century and in the middle of Europe, a powerful man, a strong man, a very wealthy man, Vladimir Putin has justified amassing 200,000 soldiers and tons of hardware and crossing the internationally recognized borders and destroying 3 provinces in Ukraine, in the largest country in Europe. And I think it's safe to say that to a large extent the whole world is going with their business as usual, other than the fact that the war in Ukraine has affected the price of gas and wheat and barley and grains and perhaps some other geopolitical issues that the affected countries might bother paying attention. But for the rest of the world, if the war has not affected their daily life, they just have some superficial sympathy with the people of Ukraine, and the atrocities continue happening on daily basis for the last 53 days. Do you think if human being 200 years ago or 100 years ago or even 20 years ago, after the downfall of Soviet Union, if we put more effort in developing the concept of human dignity and kind of teaching it, making sure that everyone on this planet has actually heard about it, at least, if not accepted it, we could prevent such disasters? I mean, this particular disaster, this crisis, has the potential to blow up far beyond the scale that it has been contained so far. It could get into a nuclear war exchange between the United States and Russia. It could really disrupt the flow of gasoline and oil to Europe for the foreseeable future, and it could descend Europe into darkness and coldness of winters, and it could really disrupt international politics and really divide the world. Do you think that we as human beings, and not just academicians and the people who understand and they've been concerned with the concepts like dignity, human dignity, if we were more aggressive, if we assumed more responsibility, if we made this the advent and universalization of the concept of human dignity more acceptable and more potent and more widely advertised, if not accepted, we could have prevented tragedies like this?
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult to say with respect to something like Ukraine. I mean, I'll just state my sort of personal view that a lot of these kinds of conflicts are just inherent to a global order that is dominated by sovereign, independent states. And I think that's been a problem for a very long time. And as long as that's the primary format of international relations, I think there's always going to be a risk of these kinds of flare-ups. So I don't think I would be so bold as to say that had I written my book 40 years ago and people actually read it and changed the way they educated kids, it would have preempted something like this. I think that's unlikely in the absence of some radical rethinking of the way the global political order is structured. But that doesn't mean that I'm totally pessimistic about this, because I think what one wants to do is to actually look. I mean, the media, as you know, it has a bias towards catastrophe, right? The media talks mostly about bad news. It doesn't cover the things that are going well because it doesn't sell newspapers. It's not sexy. It doesn't appeal to people's desire to be to feel that they're part of some unfolding catastrophe. But there's an interesting psychological story why people are sort of drawn to that. But what I would want to do is because I think human dignity is a real thing. It's not notional, right? It's of course not visible in the way that the attributes and traits of wood, or this is blue. It's not visible in quite that way, right? But you certainly notice its absence, right? And I think we would do well to think more about the practices that we do cultivate, that do dignify human life and that do make for civilization. I think the sciences and the intellectual institutions, universities more generally, provide another good case where we've quite successfully civilized ourselves, and for the most part, treat ourselves with a degree of respect and kindness, and don't systematically abuse one another. So I think what I would suggest is that we focus more on the success stories than on the catastrophes, and then try to build out from there some story about, how we might think in terms of education, socialization, other things, how we might broaden these venues for dignity and civility and so forth in a broader range of categories. But I also don't think that's a distinctively national project. I think that's a totally cosmopolitan endeavor. If I may, I want to actually go back. Something occurred to me. It's related to your question. I know it's a question in a way for you. It occurs to me that one of the things that's different about Ukraine and Syria is that the way it's being reported in the West, and I'm sure there were heroes in Syria too, it's just that they weren't widely reported, right? I think one of the things that people are responding to in the Ukraine case is this very tangible evidence of the Ukrainians refusing to give in, right? And I think that's what's causing people in the West to jump for joy and be very, very impressed by their courage and heroism. But it's also the thing, of course, that is leading us to feel slightly helpless, because it's very difficult for us, I think, to conceive of ways that we can, in a really active way, stand with them in such a courageous and heroic way. But I have to say, there is a part of me that says, if I'm being tough-minded about this, if you think of the doctrine of mutual assured destruction during the Cold War, right? I mean, if these policymakers today who are urging us to be super careful about a no-fly zone in Ukraine because if we shot a Russian fighter down, well, there's the nuclear option. I don't, and then we might be in something far, far worse. And of course, I see the force of that. But I also don't understand how those same people are the people who've been telling us for much of the last 100 years, or slightly less than that, since the end of the Second World War, that mutual assured destruction works. But if mutual assured destruction works, then Putin wouldn't use nuclear weapons because we've got a deterrent. And so you'd think that the nuclear option would basically cancel itself out, and we ought to have the courage of our convictions and impose a no-fly zone and protect the Ukrainians. I mean, I feel strongly the force of that view. I'm glad I'm not the one who has to make the decision, because it's certainly the case that the consequences could be disastrous for many more people. But if you actually believe in the doctrine that has dominated since the Second World War, there really shouldn't be an obstacle to standing up more aggressively for the Ukrainians in that way. And I think there's actually a yearning among people in the West and elsewhere in the world, no doubt, to do something a little bit more and not be quite as sort of cowardly in the face of this. Was it small, homeopathic, let's send them a few missiles, but we really don't want to piss Putin off too much because he's a dangerous and slightly unbalanced man. If we accept the nuclear deterrent doctrine, we shouldn't be as worried about that as people in power today are being.
I completely agree with you. I think that's a very good and delicate point that you brought up. I think I also would say that, the leaders, the world leaders, especially the leader of the United States, President Biden, if he really understands and believes in the concepts and the utility and the consequences of the policy of mutual assured destruction, he should not really have a second thought about going all out to help the people of Ukraine. They should establish no-fly zone. They should give the Ukrainians the more aggressive, the more less defensive and more aggressive weapons, so that they can take the war to the next level and not just sit there and defend themselves, but actually go out there and recapture and take occupational forces, expel the occupational forces and take the lands back from the occupying forces. I think the excuse that the European leaders and the President of the United States is using is some kind of I think it's a pathetic reason, to be quite honest, for not wanting to stand up to the responsibility. I think they're hoping that at the expense of Ukrainian people, an attrition war would be the kind of war that will eventually exhaust and bring fatigue to the Russians and eventually bring Putin to the negotiating table. If that's what they're hoping, I think they're mistaken, because Putin is not the kind of person who will accept anything less than total victory anywhere.
But if I may, I mean, even if they're right, even if the war of attrition was a good strategy, right, there's still a strong objection to it in the name of human dignity, because
exactly, it's an assault on human dignity.
Well, it treats the Ukrainians as resources, right? You're asking them to bear all of these costs for the sake of your strategy, and the question is, why should you do that?
Yes.
Now, of course, there's going to be collateral damage if we get more involved as well, right? But I do think that it's probably the more honorable course. And honor and dignity are very closely connected.
Exactly. I think fear, I mean, people who talk about dignity, people who see and believe in the usefulness and the utility of the concept of human dignity are the ones who don't live their lives based on fear, and those who said that imposing no-fly zone and giving MiG-29s to the Ukrainians will escalate the war and will provoke Putin to take. I mean, I don't know what provocation mean when a man has crossed the international borders without any provocations to begin with. So it's not the provocation. I mean, the word provocation with respect to Putin is the wrong word to use. I think we have to go back to the basic concepts. I think human dignity can really play a very important role. I think the people who refrained from giving the Vladimir Zelensky and the Ukrainian people the kind of weapon that could really shorten this war and could send a very strong message to Putin. I mean, is it safe, Colin, to say that these people don't believe in human dignity?
Well, I mean, they may or may not believe in it. Again, for me, human dignity isn't really a cognitive thing. It's really a matter of what you do and how you're motivated to do what you do, right? And I think that's where the problem is. I think there's a certain degree of cowardice. But I think you're also right that, I mean, one of the things that's been both surprising and I think hopeful about this episode is just how willing ordinary people are to side with Zelensky and the Ukrainians. I mean, I live in a very conservative part. I mean, you know, the university town, of course, is a bit of a kind of exception. It's like West Point in the during the Cold War. But, you know, you drive around in central Virginia and you're very quickly in a part of America that is, you'd expect to be highly conservative, very cautious and very isolationist and not concerned about what's happening in other parts of the world. But I'm really surprised when I drive around Charlottesville how often I see people who have Ukrainian colors up on their mailboxes. They've painted trees, they've painted lampposts. And it's not just the students, it's ordinary people out in the countryside. And I think you're right that the leaders probably are not picking up on just how much there is a willingness to take a stronger line. You know, exactly what causes the cowardice on the part of the leaders is a complicated story. But I think that's right. It's not robust enough to my mind.
And your observation is fascinating in Virginia, and you know that while it brings delight to my heart and to your heart, I'm sure, it actually increases the burden of responsibility on our shoulder. It tells us that the world, even the part of the world that we brand as conservative, they have this inherent quality of human dignity and having sympathy for other human beings. And they're prepared to actually do some sacrifices, but we somehow allow our leaders to get away with it. And that, I mean, in the remaining 2 minutes, I want to ask you to give a comment about, I mean, I don't want to single out the President of the United States and put all the burdens of responsibility on him. I also want to bring Europeans, you know, primarily Germany and the countries in Europe who allowed in the last 20 years to become so dependent on Russia's gas and oil And if they couldn't, if the leaders couldn't predict that Putin has the capability of doing what he eventually did on February 24th, I think that disqualifies them by their inability to really stand up to the job description of the Chancellor of Germany or the President of France or the Prime Minister of England. Why did they allow this to happen? And now they're telling us, well, look, guys, we are 40% dependent, 50% dependent, 17% dependent on the Russian gas and oil, and there's no way that we can stop sending $1 billion a day to Putin. So in other words, the Europeans, by this lack of, I don't want to call it lack of foresight and fortitude, but by not using human dignity, the possibility that someday this man could do something that because of our overdependence on these energy resources, we would have our hands tied behind our back and we should send him $1 billion a day, allow him to massacre the people of Ukraine. Do you think the concept of human dignity, even there, it could be useful and enlightening for European leaders to prevent a similar catastrophe in the future?
Well, what I hope happens is, what we've seen over the last 30 years in all of the Western countries is an increasing stridency in ideological confrontation over largely trivial narcissism of minor differences kinds of issues. And I think if the Ukraine situation does us any good, it will be in the form of reminding us that behind all of the ideological labels and the amour-propre about whose tribe you side with, people's basic lives, identities, futures, narratives are at stake. And I would hope that might lead us to think more seriously about human dignity and not about where we stand on some ideological spectrum.
And on that note, we have to bring this segment to an end, and I appreciate and I thank you very much for graciously agreeing to share your fascinating ideas with us. I enjoyed reading your book, and I hope that you allow me to reach out to you and ask you for an hour of your time here and there to talk about these issues that it seems to me like we have a lot in common as far as our sensitivity to some underlying concepts that have been underused in the international politics and in society at large. And hopefully this way we can play a little part to make the concept of human dignity a more mainstream concept and more useful than it has been in the past. Thank you very much, Professor Burr.
Thank you.
And I say farewell to our viewers and bring the show to an end. Thank you.
Cheers.